The aim of this lesson is to teach you how to land the aircraft safely, following a correctly planned approach and circuit. We'll also be teaching you standard circuit rejoining procedures. When you first saw an aircraft land, you probably thought that the procedure looked difficult and maybe even dangerous. A student, struggling to come to terms with his aircraft, once remarked that any fool could fly an aircraft. The trouble was that hardly anyone could land it properly. However, although the knack of successful landing takes time to master, the problem is nothing like as daunting as it may appear at first. For example, you may already have found that the closing speed between your aircraft and the ground is not as high as you perhaps first thought. Nevertheless, you'll find at first that flying during an approach and landing seems much more demanding than upper air work. You'll tend to feel rushed initially, and you may have the impression that you're lagging behind the aircraft. In this respect, you can help yourself and your instructor by learning your circuit checks thoroughly. You'll then be able to complete them quickly and accurately so that you're ready for the next phase of the circuit, including the approach and landing. Never forget that a landing is unlikely to be good unless it's preceded by a good approach. Similarly, the approach is unlikely to be a good one unless it's part of a well-planned circuit. The aim of the air exercise is to teach you the various techniques of approaching and landing. To begin with, you'll be taught the standard circuit and the normal powered approach. We'll assume that the circuit is left-hand. Once you've mastered these, you'll learn the various approaches and procedures shown here. How to land from a glide approach. How to land from a flapless approach. How to cope with different weather and wind conditions. How to rejoin the circuit. How to go around from a misjudged approach or landing. How to land in a restricted space using the short landing technique. You'll not necessarily be taught all these exercises in this order, and it will take several flights for your instructor to teach them to you. However, you'll undoubtedly find that your confidence increases as you become more proficient in the circuit. Before we look at these exercises in more detail, there are a number of things that you need to be aware of. We'll start with a series of definitions. By now, you'll be fairly familiar with the circuit, as you'll have seen several flown by your instructor on earlier exercises. But why do you need to fly a circuit? Well, in order to position and prepare for a landing, the pilot has to take account of the wind, the runway, and other aircraft. Experience has shown that this can be done more easily and more safely by flying an organized pattern around the landing path at a given height. This organized pattern is known as the circuit, and it's illustrated here. The circuit direction is normally left-hand, but occasionally it may be right-hand. The circuit has several distinct parts. The crosswind leg is flown on a heading away from the runway, which will enable you to track over the ground at right angles to the runway in use. Local procedures may vary, but typically, if you're starting a normal circuit straight after takeoff, the crosswind leg starts after your climbing turn at 500 feet above airfield level. Until you reach circuit height, the crosswind leg is flown as a climb. Once you reach circuit height, it's flown in level flight. If you're rejoining the circuit after an upper air exercise, you'll fly the crosswind leg in a different position. This will be fully explained in the section on rejoining. The downwind leg follows the crosswind leg and is flown parallel to the landing path, but in the opposite direction to the landing path. While flying this leg, the pilot prepares his aircraft for landing by doing the pre-landing checks. The base leg takes the aircraft back towards the runway on a track at right angles to the landing path. On this leg, you make further preparations for the landing, before making a descending or final turn onto the final approach. Typically, you complete your final turn by 400 feet above airfield level. At that stage, you should be lined up, with your wings level, on the extended center line of the runway in use, In other words, established on the final approach. The dead side of the circuit is the airspace extending out from the landing path on the side opposite to that of the downwind leg. The roundout is the stage at the end of the final approach, where the pilot puts the aircraft into the landing attitude just above the runway. The touchdown point is the point where the aircraft wheels first touch the ground. The landing run refers to the distance covered on the ground after touchdown before the aircraft stops. For many reasons, you may find it necessary to discontinue your circuit or approach, and to go around for another circuit and landing. If you're still at circuit height, the procedure is to continue a square circuit onto the dead side. On the other hand, if you've started your descent on the base leg or final approach, you employ the go-around procedure. In order to practice as many landings as possible in a given time, we use the touch-and-go landing. Instead of stopping the aircraft on the runway after landing, we open up to full power and carry out another takeoff. Another term for this is the roller landing. The threshold speed is that indicated airspeed you should have as you cross the threshold of the landing strip, that is, the commencement of the available landing area. We'll now discuss some of the principles of flight which apply to the circuit, the approach, and the landing. An understanding of these will enable you to cope more easily with the variety of aircraft configurations and weather conditions which you'll encounter in the circuit area. In previous flying exercises, you practiced using flap for descending, and in exercise 10 you saw the effect of flap on the stalling speed. When approaching to land, we use flap for the following reasons: to give a steeper descent path for a given airspeed and hence better obstacle clearance, to give a better view over the nose of the aircraft, to give a lower stalling speed, which in turn enables us to use a lower approach speed, a lower threshold speed. The subsequent touchdown speed will also be lower, giving a shorter landing run. Wind direction and strength have a marked effect on circuit flying. You must therefore be conscious of the wind speed and direction whenever you're in the circuit. This will allow you to fly the correct headings to make good the tracks necessary for a correctly shaped circuit. These headings will vary as the wind varies, so you must be continuously aware of the wind speed and direction in every circuit you fly. In this example on the screen, the wind is blowing directly down runway 19. If you don't check the wind when rejoining, you'll have a poor chance of making a good circuit and approach. On screen now you see a wind blowing roughly from 235 degrees. Remember, however, that the windsock will give you a guide to the wind direction at surface level only. Sometimes you'll find an unexpected difference between wind at surface level and the wind at circuit height. If you fly a circuit taking the speed and direction of the surface wind into account, and the circuit fails to conform to the correct shape, think first about the wind, and adjust the headings for your next circuit accordingly. If you have a heading bug on your DI or compass, it's recommended that you set it to the runway heading, and this will help you in choosing headings to fly on each leg of the circuit. You can see that with this runway and this wind, the aircraft will experience a crosswind component on every circuit leg, including the takeoff and landing. Notice how the aircraft adjusts its heading on the various legs in order to adopt a wind correction angle which will enable it to fly the correct circuit pattern. Take note, too, of how the position of the heading bug helps the pilot visualize the position of the runway relative to his heading. Remember that you're seeing the DI exactly as the pilot sees it in the cockpit. Use your pause button to stop the aircraft on each leg of the circuit to discover what heading the pilot is steering in order to compensate for the wind direction and strength and to maintain the correct rectangular circuit pattern. There are three main reasons why, whenever possible, the final approach and landing is made into wind. An approach into wind gives a steeper descent path and hence better obstacle clearance. For a given airspeed, the ground speed is at a minimum. Thus, the ground speed at touchdown is lower when landing into wind, and this gives a shorter landing run. As there is no drift, the undercarriage will not be subjected to undesirable side loads. In the circuit, the term wind gradient refers to the progressive decrease in wind speed in the lower layers of air near the ground. It's most pronounced when a strong wind is blowing over uneven ground surfaces. On your screen you can see this wind gradient represented by blue lines, which decrease in length as they get closer to the ground, indicating the decrease in wind speed just mentioned. A pronounced wind gradient causes a sudden reduction in indicated airspeed, and this will cause an aircraft, approaching to land, to sink suddenly. Sometimes the wind gradient effect is accentuated by a downdraft, which, combined with the loss of lift, can cause the aircraft to sink very rapidly. The dangers of this effect near the ground are obvious. Therefore, if you encounter a wind gradient, increase your approach speed and use power to arrest the extra rate of descent as the aircraft starts to sink. Gusts can cause similar problems on the approach to those which are caused by wind shear. Gusts can also exacerbate the effects of wind shear. Gusts are sudden changes in wind direction and strength, mostly caused by strong thermal activity combined with moderate to high wind speeds. Consequently, gusts are most vigorous when the wind is strong on hot days, because this is when the effect of thermal currents caused by the uneven heating of the Earth's surface is most pronounced. Gusts can also occur when thunderstorms or showers are nearby. The effect of gusts is similar to that of a wind gradient, except that a sudden increase in airspeed and lift as well as a decrease may occur. In very gusty conditions it may be best to use no flap at all. From the end of the downwind leg, and particularly in the later stages of the final approach, you're flying at reduced airspeed. Because your stalling speed increases in a turn, you must not use more than 30 degrees of bank during the final turn. This is no problem, provided that you judge correctly the point at which to start the final turn. The most common fault is delaying the start of the turn until the aircraft has almost reached the extended centerline of the runway, and then starting a normal turn which has to be increased to higher angles of bank in order to line up with the runway. The factors affecting the length of the landing run are identical to factors affecting the length of the takeoff run, which we dealt with in some detail in the briefing on takeoff and climb. Those factors are shown here. If you have any questions about them, ask your instructor for clarification. The full theory of landing performance is covered in detail on the Flight Planning and Performance CD-ROM of the Oxford Transair JAA PPL computer-based training series. Let's now consider the main airmanship points of flying in the circuit. The circuit area is often very busy, with several aircraft practicing circuits and landings, taking off or rejoining. A high standard of airmanship is therefore essential. You must keep a good lookout at all times and be aware of other aircraft in the circuit. Never forget to carry out all the required checks at the correct time, or to make the RT calls required by air traffic control or local procedures. Flying at the appropriate speeds in the circuit is also of vital importance, especially on the approach to land. In particular, remember the following points. When turning downwind, watch for aircraft joining onto the downwind leg at circuit height. When doing the pre-landing checks, downwind, do not concentrate your gaze in the cockpit for the duration of the checks. Look out before you start the checks and continue to look out for other aircraft, except when it's necessary to look in the cockpit at a particular item listed in the checks. On the base leg, look out away from the circuit for other aircraft on finals doing different types of circuit or approaches. You must be conscientious when doing your pre-landing checks, and you must do each one deliberately. One of the most common faults in carrying out the checks is to say a check, for example, fuel, content sufficient, but then not actually look to see that they are sufficient. In other words, always think about what you're checking. If you find yourself too close to an aircraft ahead of you in the circuit, never extend your downwind leg to gain more separation. Aircraft behind you will then have to do the same, and the result is that circuits get bigger and bigger, so that no one is able to practice a proper approach. If your separation is inadequate, go around at circuit height, adjusting your spacing as you do so that the next time you're downwind you can continue to make a normal approach from the correct position. As a general rule, never orbit on the downwind or base legs to gain separation, as such action confuses those behind you. Always make your RT calls at the correct position in the circuit. This enables air traffic control and other aircraft to pinpoint where you are in the circuit. Pay close attention to the replies from air traffic control, particularly after your final call. The normal positions for RT calls are shown here, although local procedures may vary. For example, many airfields do not require a call on base leg. Your chances of making a good landing from a misjudged approach are poor. In such cases, you should always go around, and as you do so, try to analyze where you made a mistake on your first attempt. Never be too proud to admit your mistakes. The threshold speeds for each different type of approach will be found in the pilot's operating handbook, or in the flight checklist. You must learn these speeds. If there is gustiness or turbulence on the approach, consider increasing the threshold speed by an appropriate amount. In some conditions it may be prudent to use no flap. Your instructor will explain to you how to decide on the appropriate threshold speed and aircraft configuration. We can now move on to a more detailed look at each of the various types of circuit and approach you'll be taught. Remember that although these descriptions are based on the circuits flown by the PA-28 Warrior, the same principles and techniques apply to most light aircraft, and indeed to aircraft in general. Some common faults will be mentioned, but in the main, discussion of these will be left to your instructor. He will demonstrate each type of circuit, and will then help you to improve your own judgment so that you can, eventually, prevent or correct your own errors. As you progress, you must learn to rely less and less on your instructor, and learn to exercise your own judgment and take action accordingly. Your instructor cannot consider sending you solo until you consistently fly an accurate circuit, make safe landings, and correct mistakes, all without his intervention. The normal circuit, shown here, is the first type of circuit, approach and landing, that you will be shown. This pattern is regarded as the standard circuit, all other types of circuit being related to and explained by means of this standard circuit. We shall therefore break this circuit down into its component parts and discuss each in turn. The approach we shall consider from this standard circuit will be the powered approach. Note that the heights shown for turning onto the crosswind leg, the downwind leg, and for completing the final turn may vary from airfield to airfield and from aircraft to aircraft. The heights on screen are, however, typical for light aircraft flying at airfields without specific procedures for obstacle clearance or noise abatement. Before turning onto the crosswind leg, the speed and the direction of the wind must be considered. Having considered the wind, turn onto a heading to make good a track 90 degrees to the runway. Use your directional indicator as a guide. But remember that a direction indicator will not be very accurate after several circuits unless it's reset. Note that the DI on the screen represents the instrument as seen by the pilot in the cockpit. For the purposes of this circuit, in order to give representative direction indicator readings for a PA-28, we assume that the runway in use is runway 19 and that the wind is from 190 degrees at 20 knots. Having selected a heading on the direction indicator or selected a heading towards a suitable reference point, look back at the runway and check that you are tracking correctly. The most common fault on this leg is to fly a heading at 90 degrees to the runway without any wind allowance. You then start the downwind leg too far downwind. This reduces the time available to do the pre-landing checks. After leveling off, make sure you trim accurately and check that you're in balance. Now make a 30-degree banked level turn and roll out onto a track reciprocal to the landing path. Once again, use your compass or direction indicator as a guide. You are now starting the downwind leg. When you've completed your turn onto the downwind leg, proceed as follows. Check that you are straight and level and in balance at 95 knots. You'll need to trim while maintaining level flight. Check that you're the correct distance out from the runway. At the correct distance out in the Warrior, the landing path should appear just inside the wingtip. At the same time, assess any tendency to converge or diverge with the runway and adjust your heading accordingly. Pick a reference point ahead, outside the circuit area. This will help you maintain your heading while you do the pre-landing checks. When you're level with the upwind end of the runway, call downwind on the RT and state your intention to land, touch and go, or low approach. Complete your checks, and when you've done so, check that you are still paralleling the runway. Monitor the airspeed and adjust power to maintain 95 knots. We must now judge when to turn onto the base leg. The distance you go downwind depends on the wind strength. Your instructor will show you how the turn-in point varies in different wind conditions. At the right moment, make a 30-degree banked level turn onto the base leg. Remember that the wind will be blowing from the airfield towards you on the base leg, so that to track at 90 degrees to the runway, you must turn through more than 90 degrees. The extra amount depends on the wind strength. Once again, use your direction indicator or a reference point to maintain the correct heading. When you've straightened out from the turn onto the base leg, proceed as follows. Check that you're straight and level and in balance, and ensure that you're tracking at 90 degrees to the runway. Now reduce power to a figure appropriate to your position and wind velocity. In a Warrior, in average wind conditions, you'd set 1500 RPM, select 25 degrees of flap, select the descending attitude for 75 knots, and trim. The most important thing to do now is to maintain the correct speed, for only then will you be able to accurately assess if your power setting is the right one to maintain the correct descent path. Before starting the final turn, look to the outside of your circuit along the extended centre line of the runway for other aircraft. During the turn, don't exceed 30 degrees angle of bank. In fact, if you plan correctly, 15 to 20 degrees angle of bank will be adequate. Your aim is now to have your wings level, lined up with the runway, at a height of not less than 400 feet AGL. On completion of the turn, call final. When on the final approach, select full flap, reduce speed to the correct figure for your type of aircraft, it's 70 knots for the Warrior, and trim. Your instructor will show you how to recognize the correct approach path using the aspect of the runway. Your instructor will also show you how to adjust your approach path with power and how to maintain the correct approach speed through your control of the aircraft's attitude. This video clip illustrates the correct approach path as viewed by the pilot of a Warrior. The clip ends just before the roundout. The three views of the runway aspect shown on your screen now show an aircraft on the correct approach path, an aircraft which is too high on the approach, and an aircraft which is too low. If you hold the correct approach path and speed, you will touch down correctly at the beginning of the designated landing area. If you are too high on the approach, you will overshoot and touch down well into the landing area. If you are too low on the approach, you will undershoot and touch down before the designated landing area. Once settled on the correct approach path, with full flap selected and the aircraft trimmed, maintain the correct airspeed. The airspeed is controlled by the attitude. If the airspeed increases, you should select a slightly higher nose attitude to reduce it. To prevent the aircraft climbing above the correct approach path, you must throttle back slightly as you raise the nose. Remember, however, that only very small movements of the control column and throttle are required. If your speed falls, select a lower nose attitude and increase power to prevent the aircraft descending below the correct approach path. As we've said, your instructor will demonstrate the correct approach path to you and will teach you how to maintain that path, so that your aircraft touches down just beyond a point on the runway that you, as the pilot, will have chosen. Your instructor will most probably refer to this point as the aiming point. The aiming point will usually be a selected real or imaginary point or other feature, sufficiently in from the runway threshold to guide you to a safe touchdown in the designated landing area. Here we've illustrated an imaginary line joining the runway markers which mark the beginning of the designated landing area. The aiming point will be the point where this imaginary line intersects with the runway center line. If your approach path is correct, the aiming point will remain in a constant position relative to the top of the instrument panel coaming. A correct approach should look similar to the one we've already shown you, and which you see again on screen now. This video clip shows the correct glide path aspect, flown on an actual approach. If you find yourself getting too high on the approach, the aiming point will appear to move down the windscreen. In this case, you reduce power, taking care to maintain the correct approach speed by adjusting your attitude if necessary. Having reduced power, you should find that the aircraft returns to the correct approach path. You may find that you have to increase power again by a small amount to maintain the correct approach path. If you find yourself getting too low on the approach, the aiming point will appear to move up the windscreen. In this case, you increase power, taking care to maintain the correct approach speed by adjusting your attitude if necessary. Having increased power, you should find that the aircraft returns to the correct approach path. You may find that you have to reduce power again by a small amount to maintain the correct approach path. When you're close to the ground, don't make large corrections to the attitude to correct for airspeed. They're not necessary. If, for instance, you notice that your airspeed is decreasing at this stage of the approach, increase the power. This will not only accelerate the aircraft back to the correct speed, but also reduce the rate of descent. Conversely, if your speed is increasing above the approach speed at this stage of the approach, reduce the power slightly. Cross the threshold at the correct speed for your aircraft. Elevator and throttle movements must be gentle and coordinated if the aircraft is to stay on the correct approach path at the correct speed. There are two common faults on the final approach: bad trimming, leading to poor speed control; overcorrecting on the throttle through not allowing for the inertia of the aircraft. Make small corrections and allow time for them to take effect. In the final stages of the approach, we're getting very near the ground, and we need to think about the actual landing. The landing is considered in 5 stages: the round out, hold off, the touchdown, the landing run, and vacating the runway. We look here at the technique used for landing an aircraft with a tricycle undercarriage, such as the Warrior. The technique used in landing an aircraft with a tail wheel is very slightly different. If you're learning to fly on a tail dragger, your instructor will teach you that specific technique. On the final approach, the aircraft's rate of descent is too high, and the approach path too steep for landing. We must, therefore, reduce the rate of descent and flatten the approach path by rounding out. Your instructor will teach you how to judge the correct height at which to start the round out. This will be at about 20 to 25 feet above the runway. The round out height has often been described as the height at which the ground seems to expand around you in your peripheral vision, sometimes referred to as the ground rush. To round out, ease the control column gently back to raise the nose so that the aircraft is flying level just above the runway. And, at the same time, close the throttle. During this stage, it's essential that you look well at the runway to gain a general impression of your proximity to the ground. This clip shows the round out as seen by a Warrior pilot. If you round out at the correct speed and raise the nose by the correct amount, the aircraft will now be flying level 1 or 2 feet above the runway. With the throttle closed, airspeed decreases and the aircraft will begin to sink. By gradually easing back on the control wheel and raising the nose, the pilot checks the tendency to sink. This is what we call the hold-off. The aircraft will continue to decelerate and, if the hold-off has been carried out correctly, the aircraft will touch down, main wheels first, in the landing attitude. Maintain the control column position until the nose wheel touches down. Don't force it onto the runway. Conversely, don't try to hold the nose wheel off because there is then a danger of the tail skid hitting the runway. This clip attempts to show the hold-off and touchdown as seen by a Warrior pilot. Don't relax after touchdown. The landing is not complete until the aircraft has stopped. Hold the control column slightly aft of the neutral position and keep straight using nose-wheel steering. Test the brakes and, if necessary, use them to ensure that you are at taxiing speed before reaching the end of the runway. While on the runway, brake the aircraft to a slow walking pace in a straight line. Turn off the runway at an appropriate exit point or taxiway. When well clear of the runway, bring the aircraft to rest and apply the parking brake. Complete the after-landing checks in the normal way, using the checklist. Remember that you must always stop to carry out the after-landing checks. Here is a video clip showing a complete powered approach for landing. If every landing during your flying training, or say while practicing solo circuits, were a full stop landing, a lot of time and money would be wasted on the ground. Therefore, in order to achieve the greatest number of takeoffs and landings during a sortie, touch and goes are flown. For a touch and go, make a normal approach and landing, but instead of stopping after touchdown, complete another takeoff immediately. With the aircraft on all three wheels, keep straight with nose wheel steering, raise the flap to the takeoff position, and open up to full power. Continue the takeoff in the normal way. If, during an approach, you notice anything which may prevent your landing the aircraft safely, for instance because the landing path is not clear or because you've misjudged your approach, you may elect to initiate a go-around. The go-around procedure is as follows. Level the wings, apply full power and prevent yaw with rudder. Look out and transition to the climb, reducing the amount of flap in stages. Do not raise the flaps in one go. On the Warrior, you'd reduce the flap setting to 25 degrees at this stage. Climb at the recommended speed and configuration for your aircraft type, and trim. If the circuit has a dead side, turn towards it and continue to climb on the dead side of the runway so that you can keep in view both the runway and the climb-out path. Note that the go-around procedure may vary from airfield to airfield. Raise the remaining flap when you're above 200 feet AGL. Complete the climb to circuit height. Maintain a safe distance between yourself and other aircraft. Then, join the crosswind leg. We'll now examine a number of variations on the normal circuit, starting with the glide approach. The circuit for the glide approach is planned so that when you're on the base leg, you close the throttle when you estimate that you are within gliding range of your selected initial aiming point. Your objective is to make a safe landing inside the designated landing area without the use of power. If you find that you do need power to achieve a safe landing, then your glide approach will have been unsuccessful. Consequently, because without power, undershooting must be excluded, the initial aiming point is selected well into the landing area. When you're certain that you will achieve your initial aiming point, you can then lower full flap and touch down at the beginning of the designated landing area. The glide approach not only gives you good practice in landing safely following an engine failure, but should also be regarded as a precision exercise to improve your flying ability and judgment. The diagram shown here lets you compare the relative positions of base legs and final approaches of the various types of circuit for an assumed common wind direction and strength. You can see that the glide approach requires you to turn onto base leg earlier than usual, and that the final approach is somewhat steeper than normal. The main considerations for base leg and finals are as follows. After you've turned onto the base leg, you have to decide when to close the throttle, based on an initial aiming point, without flap, some 300 meters past the threshold. As an aid to judging when to close the throttle, you must visualize the curved approach pattern that you must fly to achieve your aiming point. As you see on the screen now, that curved path will differ depending on such things as wind strength and thermal activity. When you're convinced that the gliding performance of the aircraft is sufficient to enable you to follow this flight path, then close the throttle, put carb heat on, and trim for the correct gliding speed. From now on, it's important to concentrate on the visual picture. From the point at which the throttle is closed, the landing area will have a different perspective in different wind conditions. With practice, you'll soon be able to assess whether or not the rate of change of perspective is sufficient to meet the flight path requirement. A correct rate of change can be achieved by adjusting the flight path with bank. You should not use more than 30 degrees of bank for the turn from base leg to finals. If you've closed the throttle in the correct place, you should be lined up on the final approach at between 300 and 500 feet AGL, depending on wind conditions. There are several considerations you must bear in mind on the final approach. As you turn from base leg towards the extended centerline of the runway, you must decide when to lower flap. Assess your approach path by using the perspective of the runway. If the aircraft is clearly achieving the initial aiming point that you choose, then you may lower flap in stages to bring the aiming point back towards the runway threshold. Remember that you will touch down some distance beyond the aiming point. Don't be in a hurry to lower full flap. You should bear in mind the possibility of passing through wind gradients in the final stages of the approach, which would steepen your glide path as you attempt to maintain approach speed. As experience is gained, you'll be able to use full flap to achieve the required point of touchdown in different wind conditions. When lowering flap, care must be taken to adjust the nose attitude to maintain the correct gliding speed. On the Warrior, this would be 75 knots. During a glide approach, you'll have a much higher rate of descent and a more nose-down attitude than for a powered approach. Be aware, too, that the stalling speed without power is higher. Also, because of the higher rate of descent, the round-out should be started earlier than for a powered approach. Remember to select carb heat off before opening the throttle for a touch and go or go-around. The actual landing technique from a glide approach is the same as that for a powered approach. If you find yourself low on the approach path during a glide approach, you must never attempt to stretch the glide by raising the nose of the aircraft. You will almost certainly misjudge some of your early attempts at a glide approach, and will probably find that some fall short of your planned touchdown point. You must resist the tendency to try and increase your glide range by raising the nose to keep it pointing at your selected touchdown point, in the vain hope that you will, thereby, reach that goal. If you attempt to do this, airspeed will decrease. If your attention is concentrated on your touchdown point, you may well not notice this decrease. As you've learned, gliding performance decreases if you fly either above or below your best glide speed. You will thus merely worsen the situation by raising the nose to try and stretch the glide. In the worst case, you will stall the aircraft. And at this low height, the result of that would be catastrophic. So, if it becomes obvious to you that you're going to undershoot, make an early decision to go around. There is also little point in continuing with a glide approach that is too high. So, once again, go around. Don't delay your decision to go around to the point where it becomes necessary to move the throttle rapidly from idle to full power. Although the engine will usually respond, this is poor technique and airmanship. Furthermore, there are occasions when rapid throttle movement can lead to momentary rough running and a consequent loss of power. We'll now look at the flapless approach. You will most probably never find yourself in a situation where you are unable to operate the flaps. Nevertheless, in an aircraft with electrically driven flaps, power failure is obviously a possibility. You may also, of course, elect to carry out a flapless approach against a strong wind. On the flapless approach, your approach path will be much shallower than for a normal approach. You will also need to use more power than on a normal approach, and this will give you an even shallower approach path. Consequently, as shown here, your downwind leg will be longer than that for a normal powered approach, As with all circuits, the planning for the final approach begins on the downwind leg. Your instructor will show you the exact point at which to turn onto the base leg. It will certainly be past the turn-in point for a normal powered approach. We now go on to look at the main considerations which apply to base leg, finals, and landing for a flapless approach. On the base leg, you'll have no flap to select, so you'll need a lower power setting to reach the final turn by 500 feet AGL, flying base leg at the recommended speed. Make only small adjustments of the throttle setting and observe their effects before readjusting power as necessary. Trim accurately. Take care on your turn onto final approach. Without flap, you're nearer the stall, so do not exceed 30 degrees of bank. The final approach is longer and shallower than on a normal approach, so you must adjust power carefully. With a clean aircraft, power changes must be small, and if you don't immediately adjust your attitude and trim, your speed will be erratic. You'll notice a higher nose attitude than on a normal approach, which tends to mask your view of the runway. This effect becomes more pronounced as you reduce to your threshold speed. Landing from a flapless approach presents no unusual problems. Because of the shallow descent angle, only a very small pitch change is necessary to round out. You'll notice too that the time lapse between round out and touchdown will be longer. In other words, your hold off will be longer and you'll touch down further into the landing area. Also, the touchdown speed will be higher than that for a normal powered approach. And the ground run will be correspondingly longer than normal. Because of the extra ground run, there may be a danger of running out of runway. So the flapless approach must always be flown very accurately, with power. Aim to touch down at the beginning of the landing area. You've already learnt that whenever possible an aircraft takes off and lands into wind. However, even if an airfield possesses several runways, it's a rare day when the wind blows directly down the centre line. Consequently, you'll frequently have to fly an approach and landing with some degree of crosswind present. Theoretical considerations of the effect of crosswinds, including how to assess the magnitude of the crosswind component, are covered in Oxford Aviation Training PPL Ground Studies series of CD-ROMs. The next section of this lesson briefs you on the practical aspects of flying a circuit, approach, and landing when a component of the wind velocity is across the runway you're using. We learned earlier in this lesson, in the Principles of Flight section, how the aircraft's heading needs to be adjusted on every leg of the circuit in order to compensate for the crosswind. If you wish to revise that section, do so now before continuing. Here we'll consider aspects of flying the circuit with a crosswind, other than the pure heading considerations which you've already learnt. We'll begin with a crosswind leg. On this leg there may be either a headwind or a tailwind component. Both situations are shown on screen. Remember that the aircraft has taken off from runway 19, that is, on a heading of 190 degrees. Note then that you'll either have to begin the turn onto the downwind leg before completing the level off if you have a tailwind component, or delay the turn in order to put you the right distance out on the downwind leg if you have a headwind component. In order to track parallel to the runway on the downwind leg, it will be necessary to adjust your heading to allow for wind effect. Turn the aircraft either slightly towards the airfield in the case of a wind direction from 235 degrees, or slightly away from it in the case of a wind direction from 145 degrees. As explained earlier in this lesson, you may use the direction indicator to assist in making the drift allowance. When judging the position at which to turn onto base leg, note that the aircraft is not heading parallel to the runway, and the wingtip will therefore be displaced. Bear this in mind when using your port wingtip to estimate how far you've travelled past the end of the runway. On the base leg, in addition to the normal wind effect blowing you away from the airfield, you now have another component, which is either increasing or decreasing your ground speed on the base leg. You must therefore take action accordingly. With a headwind on the base leg, you can reduce the rate of descent and delay the turn onto final approach. If the wind is behind you, you will probably need to reduce power to start your descent earlier than normal. You'll also need to commence your turn onto final approach earlier. Beware of leaving your final turn too late, otherwise you may find that you have flown through the runway centerline and are forced into using excessive bank angles to line up with the runway. There are two recognized methods of completing the final approach and landing in a crosswind. These are the crab technique and the wing down technique. The crab technique is the one most widely used in the United Kingdom, and you'll be taught this method. Both methods employ the same circuit pattern up to and including the finals turn. But with the crab technique, you roll out of the final turn so that the aircraft is in balanced flight, wings level, on a heading that will cause it to track down the extended centerline of the runway. To do this, you'll have the nose pointing off the runway direction into the wind. Maintain or adjust your heading as appropriate to ensure that the aircraft continues to track down the extended runway centerline throughout the final approach and roundout. After the roundout, and just before the aircraft touches down, use the rudder to align the nose of the aircraft with the runway centerline. Be ready to correct any roll with aileron. Because of the crosswind, there'll be a tendency to yaw after touchdown. This is corrected with rudder and/or nosewheel steering. Full aileron into wind may then be required to prevent the wing lifting during the landing run. The aim of the short field landing exercise is that you should learn how to land in a confined space. This skill would be required if you should one day have to make a precautionary landing in a field, or if you found yourself having to approach a runway where obstacles on the runway, or an unserviceable runway surface, significantly reduced the length of usable runway available to you. The approach part of the short field landing requires you to have positive control of the aircraft's angle and rate of descent, so that you can clear any obstacles on the approach and bring the aircraft to a halt in the shortest possible distance. In order to achieve a short field landing, we want to touch down at a selected point, as early as possible into the available landing area, and reach this point at the lowest safe speed. When practicing short field landings on the airfield, we must therefore plan our circuit and approach accordingly. Bearing in mind why we may one day be obliged to carry out a short field approach, we must aim at achieving as short and slow a landing as possible, within the permitted performance parameters of the aircraft. On the downwind leg, select your touchdown point and plan your turn onto the base leg as normal, depending on the wind. The base leg is flown as for a normal powered approach, and you aim to arrive on the final approach at the same height as for a powered approach. In considering the final approach and landing, we give here speeds and flap settings for the Warrior. For other aircraft, consult the pilot's operating handbook. As soon as you've completed the turn onto final approach, lower full flap and reduce the speed to 65 knots. The objective now is to continue the approach with a combination of attitude and power that will enable us to maintain the desired airspeed and approach path. To simulate the kind of considerations which prevail during a field landing, we might aim to touch down just beyond the numbers and come to a halt in the shortest possible distance. At approximately 200 feet above ground level, reduce the speed to 55 knots by raising the nose slightly and reducing power. At 55 knots, apply power to maintain the speed and approach path until touchdown. The remainder of the approach is flown with small adjustments of power to control the rate of descent. and small changes of attitude to reach your touchdown point at a threshold speed of 55 knots. You will notice that there is a higher nose attitude and a higher power setting than for a normal powered approach. Should you begin to overshoot your touchdown point at this late stage, make only a small power reduction. A large reduction of power at this low speed will cause the aircraft to sink rapidly to the ground. Provided that the approach has been well judged, the landing presents no problems. However, you should note the following points. As you near the ground, beware of trying to arrest any unwanted sink through a change in attitude. Sink should be arrested by increasing power. Reduce speed further during the round out and hold off, and touch down close to the stalling speed. As the aircraft slows down, gently lower the nose and apply the brakes. Though your insistence on displaying good airmanship and carrying out thorough flight planning on all occasions should prevent your being caught unawares by a deteriorating weather situation, you must learn how to carry out a precautionary field landing and to fly a bad weather circuit at your airfield. Precautionary landings are dealt with in the lesson on forced landings. Here we'll deal with a situation where a lowering cloud base and deteriorating visibility at your home airfield oblige you to fly a circuit which is lower and tighter than normal in order to carry out a safe landing. This type of circuit is known as a bad weather circuit. A bad weather circuit is begun by flying overhead the runway in the landing direction at 500 to 600 feet in order to simulate your arriving over the airfield with a low cloud base. Because of the poor weather conditions and low visibility, you will have put your aircraft in the configuration for the slow, safe cruise, or bad weather configuration. In the Warrior, this would be 75 knots with 25 degrees of flap. Because of the poor visibility, you would note any useful landmarks on the circuit side of the airfield, which might help you to fly a straight downwind leg and give you a guide as to where to turn onto final. Note the compass or direction indicator heading, as this will be the heading for your final approach. On screen, the runway in use is runway 19. With the wind from 235 degrees, you observe that the heading required to track along the centre line is 195 degrees, 5 degrees to starboard. You therefore set your heading bug to 195. Knowing that your downwind leg is on a track of 010 degrees, you make a quick mental note that the heading required will have to be corrected 5 degrees to port, giving you 005 degrees. At about the level of the upwind end of the runway, make a continuous turn through 180 degrees onto the downwind leg. Use the direction indicator to help you and aim to keep either the landing path or the landmarks in sight while you do your pre-landing checks. If you have no distinct landmark to indicate when to begin your final turn, time yourself over 20 to 30 seconds, depending on wind, beginning from a point abeam the runway threshold. Then make a continuous level turn with about 15 degrees of bank onto the final approach heading. When you have the runway clearly in view, begin your descent on a normal powered approach. Before going on to look at rejoining the circuit, following upper air work or when visiting another airfield, we'll take a look at the signals square. Though they are no longer found at all airfields, the signal squares provide pertinent information on such things as circuit direction, the condition of runways and taxiways, and on airfield hazards and activities. Within the signal square, symbols are used to indicate the direction of takeoff and landing, the circuit direction, though the absence of an indication for this usually means that the circuit direction is left-hand, any restrictions or warnings about the use of the airfield. A typical example of an actual signal square is shown here. You must learn the meanings of the symbols used. When rejoining the circuit, never assume that the runway in use and the circuit direction are the same as they were for your original takeoff. When returning to or visiting any airfield, the pilot of the joining aircraft is responsible for integrating safely and expeditiously into the circuit pattern in such a way as to avoid obstructing aircraft already in the circuit. In case of conflict, traffic already in the circuit has priority. We'll look at 3 procedures for rejoining: the overhead join, the base leg join, and the straight-in approach. These 3 methods of joining the visual circuit are in use at most airfields. Be aware, though, that there may be reasons, mainly because of air traffic restrictions, why these procedures may not be permitted at any given airfield. When flying to a destination airfield, therefore, be sure to check beforehand what types of rejoin are permitted for that airfield. In general, however, if the airfield is uncontrolled, one or more of the rejoins described here should be acceptable. Before commencing any type of join, you must complete your rejoin checks. These checks should be carried out as soon as you have the airfield in sight. If you're on a cross-country flight and visiting another airfield, or if your base airfield procedures require it, make a timely radio call announcing your intentions. Even if the airfield has only a ground-to-air radio service, the operator will pass you the runway in use, circuit direction, and advisory QFE, as well as giving basic positional information about possible conflicting traffic. With the rejoin checks and radio call complete, you should give your full attention to planning your descent to circuit height. Don't forget to make an early assessment of the wind and keep a good lookout. The overhead rejoin is the most common rejoin procedure and is particularly useful when joining the circuit pattern at an airfield which has no air traffic control. A typical overhead rejoin is depicted here. It's important to identify the runway in use and direction of the circuit pattern as soon as possible, hence the need to establish early radio communication. If you're joining an airfield other than your home field, and there is no radio service, you'll need to find out the runway in use from information given by the signal square, windsock, or, most reliably, by observing traffic already in the circuit. Remain at least 1,000 feet above circuit height while you do this. Once you know the runway in use, try to approach the airfield, keeping the field on the same side as you would if you were in the circuit. That is, for a left-hand circuit, approach with the airfield on your left. Then proceed as follows. Set the runway direction on the direction indicator heading bug and join overhead at 1,000 feet above circuit height. Position yourself over the live side of the airfield, above the downwind leg, and then turn so that you cross the threshold, tracking at right angles to the runway, but pointing towards the dead side. Keep a good lookout for other traffic. Once past the runway and on the dead side, commence your descent. Look out to make sure that the area below you is clear and that no one is descending from above. Throttle back and descend at the appropriate speed. Never descend in a straight line. If you do, you can easily descend onto another aircraft and, if you've not kept a good lookout above you, someone can descend on top of you. Use just 10 degrees of bank initially in your descending turn. You can always increase the bank later if necessary. But if you start with more bank, then you may find that you have to stop the turn, and we're back with the undesirable straight descent. Aim to complete your descent so that your crosswind leg tracks across the upwind end of the runway at circuit height. This will keep you clear of other aircraft climbing after takeoff. The amount of power which this will require will depend upon your position at commencement, the wind velocity, and the runway length. Position yourself on the downwind leg. Another rejoining option is the base leg rejoin. Normally, you'll join the base leg on the live side of the circuit. That is, you would join left base when the circuit is left-hand. Joining on the live side would be obligatory at uncontrolled airfields, but at an airfield with an air traffic control unit, you may be authorized to join the base leg on the dead side if that procedure is more expeditious and doesn't interfere with traffic already in the circuit. In either case, the procedure is the same. Here we see an aircraft joining base leg at an uncontrolled airfield. The aircraft must be level at circuit height before reaching base leg, with both the rejoining and the pre-landing checks completed. The appropriate RT call, in this case established left base runway 19er, must be made at the correct place, that is, in the normal base leg position. It saves a lot of time if you're able to carry out a straight-in approach. You'd normally fly a straight-in approach only if the airfield has an air traffic control unit and if you're approaching the airfield from a direction which puts you roughly in line with the active runway. After receiving approval from air traffic control for the straight-in approach, you'll normally be required by air traffic to report at 4 and 2 miles from touchdown. At 4 and 2 miles from touchdown on a 3-degree approach angle, the aircraft would be at 1,200 and 600 feet above airfield level respectively. A light aircraft, however, would normally fly a steeper approach and be at 2,400 feet at 4 miles out and 1,200 feet 2 miles from touchdown. Pre-landing checks should be completed before you're 4 miles from touchdown. Remember that traffic already in the circuit has priority, and your aircraft must be positioned on final approach such that aircraft on base leg are not forced to overshoot. That concludes the briefing on circuits, approach and landing.